Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We're so happy to have Delegate Vivian Watts with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Woody. I always enjoy talking with you.
Likewise. Finance.
Yes, sir.
You've been on the Finance Committee for some time. You've got a lot of important issues to deal with, given what happened in Washington last year in terms of tax cuts.
Huge. And when you say some time, I have often said, how long have you been in? Ooh, an embarrassingly long time. But I had 4 years of service before resigning, going into the cabinet, and then coming back. And in those 4 years of service, 82 to 86, it was far more of a tax policy committee where we really looked at the ramifications. So I underscore that because over 50 years, because I was also very active in tax issues, local tax issues as an active citizen, I've only seen really 3 opportunities in 50 years where we can look at Virginia's tax system and look at its fairness and make the kind of changes that are fully justified. And one of those opportunities is right now, and quite frankly, I am concerned on several points that it not be just easy slogans, easy bumper sticker type of approach to it. Because
well, it's a little bit ironic, isn't it, that the opportunity to do this is on the back of huge tax cuts for corporations and individuals.
Huge tax cuts, and on the federal level, that led to significant deficits. So these policies weren't established with any kind of integrity. And so here we are in Virginia, where we must balance our budget. We can't print money like the federal government does. So when you look at those tax policies and translate them into Virginia, that's your first challenge, is it's got to be done responsibly. The second challenge is we really don't know, when you look at, give or take, 500 fine print changes in the federal tax code, multiplied times over 4 million taxpayers in Virginia, how each one of those changes is going to play out and the decisions that these 4 million tax filers are going to be making. So we really don't know the amount of revenue we're going to get, purely ballpark estimates. So here we are in this session then trying to deal with those 2 issues and take the historic opportunity and return some fairness into Virginia's tax structure. And the reason why I say return some fairness, as well as make sure that whatever we do addresses those taxpayers that are hardest hit by the federal changes when it comes to Virginia taxes, is a real challenge. And the reason why I say fairness, the federal government escalates every year by inflation the standard deduction, the personal exemption, the tax brackets. They move up by the value of the dollar. Virginia doesn't do that. We haven't changed our standard deduction since 2005.
2005.
2005.
And for an individual, that is what, $6,000?
No, for an individual, it's only $3,000.
Oh, $3,000.
For a family, it's $6,000. Now, in 2005, we were below the federal deduction, but we weren't that far out. And then as inflation creeped up. We're now sitting at $6,000 for a family. Before the federal tax cut, it was $12,000 plus. Then with the federal tax cut, it shot up to $24,000. And that is one of our biggest challenges. But I want to really underscore that, and I started down this path with intensity in late August, early September. The tax department had contracted for an analysis to the best degree possible through an independent group, Chainbridge Analytics. And they came out with a report with a lot of columns and columns of gray numbers that most people would just go tilt over. Well, I translated that to try to help understanding both myself as well as other members into any number of colorful charts so that someone could recognize what was happening with this tax change based on the income level starting at under $25,000 and going to $1 million plus.
Is that document available on your website?
I don't have it up yet for a couple of reasons, but I'm very, very tempted to. I do have a bill in which reflects my best judgment looking at this impact. Because the point that I wanted to emphasize, and I'm sorry, Woody, that I don't have a nice big chart for everyone, and I don't doubt that the camera can pick this up, but it's also been a learning curve for me. After I put the bulk of this material together, almost weekly, there would be another element that I would come to understand or that we'd get better federal guidance on. But one of the things that I ran into is an analysis, and this comes out of the tax department, of the number of filers at each income level of adjusted gross income. And what you basically see is that half of the filers are just over $40,000 adjusted gross income. Half of the filers are under that, half are above it.
So would those half under it be eligible for the earned income tax credit?
Let me answer that after emphasizing what this means as far as the standard deduction. The standard deduction gives to everybody the same standard deduction. So if you're at $30,000, if you're at $75,000, if you're at $150,000, if we raise the standard deduction, my bill would take it from $6,000 for married to $9,000, a 50% increase. Everybody on this gets that same additional $3,000 standard deduction. And that means that half of the benefit accrues to those under $40,000 of raising the standard deduction. And the reason why I want to emphasize that ties back to the fact that we don't increase any of this with inflation, so we've really gotten out of whack as far as the progressivity, the ability to pay on our tax structure. And so when you ask the question about the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit has been a federal program since, I think it goes back to Eisenhower. I know it's before Reagan, and it's always been adopted. And it's very targeted towards low-income families. You have to make, and it also escalates every year by inflation, you have to make basically under $15,000 if you're a single. So everything else is based on size of household, families, all the way up to the potential for someone who's making $54,000 and who has a family of a large family to also qualify. So with that, almost every state has said, here's what the feds do. On our state taxes, we're going to give you 1% of what the feds allow, and in Virginia, that percentage is 20%. So what happens is, now all these people are working people, they're paying taxes. 20% of what the federal allows, which is what Virginia allows, sometimes is more than the actual taxes that they owe. And that's what the issue is all about, is the refund, whether or not they get the full amount or they only get taxes owed.
So right now, Virginia does not refund.
We do not refund. And so of the 600,000 who qualify in Virginia for the Earned Income Tax Credit, this would allow a refund for approximately 400,000 who have paid all of their taxes and don't qualify for the remainder then of the earned income tax as a refund. Now, why would that be? Well, basically, if you don't own a home, if you have no deductions, you're a renter, you're a single parent who maybe just has gone through a divorce, you don't have deductions, so your taxes aren't going to be brought down by those deductions. So basically the fact that we don't refund it is penalizing people who really are at the margin, quite frankly, because again, they are renters, they are living much tighter, there's no flexibility at all in living from day to day on the money coming in. So that's what that issue is. It affects then 400,000 of the people who are filers under $54,000.
Well, why do some argue that, well, we shouldn't be giving those individuals that amount of monies? We need to take care of the middle class.
Well, I'm going to answer that question after I make the leap between those 400,000 and however you are going to define the middle class. Those 400,000 are only 1 out of 6 of the filers under 54,000.
1 out of 6.
1 out of 6. So we're only helping 1 out of 6. So that's why I really focus on also, in addition to that, also raising the standard deduction, because that then helps all, as I just indicated, all taxpayers benefit, including the low income, move it on up to the middle income, however it's defined in whatever region of the state that you're from. For those people who don't have the kind of assets for itemized deductions, this then equalizes that burden on up, and it definitely is targeted towards where the tax increase is coming because of the federal changes. To pay for this, I'm also looking at not taking the federal change, which for the very high income, which starts at $250,000, $500,000, most of it's at $1 million level, who will benefit from the federal government having removed any limit on the total deductions you can take. And the limit has been, for a married couple, $313,000. $13,000, which I think is a pretty reasonable limit, and that has been taken off, and we will lose $78 million in Virginia by taking that limit totally off. So I'm leaving the limit where it was. This helps fund then the relief to the low and middle income through the changes that we were talking about, both the earned income tax credit and a standard deduction.
So how would you define middle income? Or how does the state define middle income, if there is such a definition?
If there is such a definition, and I have looked for that definition everywhere, and there is no definition. I have to start with my first bracket being, if half of our filers make less than in the range of $40,000, under $40,000, then that's a good bracket. I certainly think the $50,000 is a good bracket of where you start middle income. But again, depending on standard of living, you're going to have particularly the new suburban families, where another one of these many federal tax changes capped the amount that you could deduct for your total state income tax payments paid and your local real estate tax payment at $10,000, and there are areas of the state where that is a problem. And all of those details are details being worked out. The bottom line is that, I guess I always say the bottom line, and then I go 1, 2, 3. Bottom line is complex. Second, the governor has stated clearly, while he has brought forward the earned income tax credit because it's a provision that many wouldn't understand, and it's time to address it. As I say, only 3 times in 50 years, in my experience, have we had this opportunity to look at these basic issues of our tax structure. But the governor has then said, my goal, just like certainly my goal, is to make sure that we target any changes to where the impact has occurred because of the federal tax changes, as well as looking at the fairness of our tax structure, which we have not addressed.
So this is the fundamental question before the General Assembly, before you spend any money because you don't know how much money there's going to be left.
Yeah, and that's also why my bill is relatively modest. Its cost is around $230 million, returning that to the taxpayers, but not going at the outside, which could be as high as $600 million by some estimates. But I really am not comfortable with those estimates at all. I'm very concerned about the state's AAA bond rating and our rating as being a well-managed state fiscally, and that if we go cavalierly, especially when all of these changes end in 2024 and without additional congressional action.
Now, those are the changes that were made that apply to individuals, not large corporations.
Well, large corporations truly are anymore large corporations. 20 years ago, the corporate tax may have picked up on more businesses, but when you look at the individual income tax, you're looking at a lot of small businesses, private contractors, a lot of people for liability purposes and sometimes for federal tax advantage now file under subchapter S, corporate, et cetera, et cetera. So it's much more of a comprehensive, particularly of all small businesses, and certainly some of those businesses that are calculated at a loss. This is also part of what you have to separate out. So that's why a simple solution is inappropriate. And when I say that, I have backed out some of those businesses when I looked at where by income category these changes are taking place. And I'm flipping to my first chart to make sure that I get my income right. So if your adjusted gross is under $50,000, your tax change would be 4% increase. If you are up to $125,000, 50 to $125,000, it's 3.5% change. Now, that's only a half percentage. No, it's the difference between 4 and 3.5. It's a significantly less of a cut when you take it up to the next level, which goes on up to $250,000. The tax change is only 2.5% increase. So as you can see, the lower income are taking a much higher percentage increase in taxes, and that's where we need to be looking to make sure that whatever we do is addressing where the tax impact is the greatest.
Now, is your voice going to be heard? I mean, I think we were discussing earlier the fact that these tax-related matters are now going to the Rules Committee as opposed to the Finance Committee.
Well, to re-quote myself of, I think it was Monday, when still another one of the tax bills were taken out of Finance Committee, my comment to the committee and to the public, I had to say for the record, I chose the word, I am sad that this committee, whose purview is to struggle with some of the things that I have just described. They are complex. This is the committee that ought to be considering all of these tax changes. It's not a matter of a back of the envelope or, as I referenced, a bumper sticker kind of approach to 500 fine print changes over 4 million taxpayers. This is complex, and we've got to, for the sake of Virginia's fiscal integrity and very, very important for the fairness of our tax structure on every single taxpayer at all levels, we've got to have serious look at this. And I'm sad that this has been given to Rules Committee.
Well, I'm sure you're happy that the Equal Rights Amendment has passed out of the Senate and will be considered here in the House. Hopefully it will get a hearing. Tell us a little bit about that Equal Rights Amendment and why it's so important.
I think the easiest way for me to understand it is that if women were treated equally under the federal Constitution, we wouldn't have needed get the right to vote. If that guarantee was there, then women wouldn't have to have been part of the Civil Rights Act. Because there was a real question that if we give all races the same rights under the Constitution, Does that include black women equally with black men? And this is one reason why that was the one change that was made to the Civil Rights Act back in, I believe it was the 60s, was to add sex, because it was important. There's no guarantee. So by finally having it as a constitutional guarantee, you then put a foundation on all laws that might be changed, that could be changed the other way, and this puts that foundation of equality under the law.
And there seems to be significant opposition to it, at least in the House. What's the rationale for the opposition, if there is one? One, I believe, relates to the date. Some people argue that the date was set by Congress to be 1982, and whether Virginia is a 38th state that would ratify the amendment, it would be ineffective, and this is just a symbolic vote. That's one of the objections.
And there's nothing wrong with it being a symbolic vote if that's where the court actions end up, because it does send a message to Congress from Virginia and from other states who have recently passed it, that if there is an interpretation that that's a deadline that must be acted upon by Congress, or our ratification won't lead to it being a constitutional amendment, fine. It puts all of the pressure under doing that. But there are several amendments where Virginia's been kind of behind on history. So I am proud if Virginia then says, even now, even if it was already in the Constitution, it's still appropriate for Virginia to make the statement that this state, particularly when we talk about the fact that we are so much a part of the national and world economy, we're not an isolated jurisdiction. And if we're going to have the economic growth, if we're going to have that kind of openness, this is an important symbol.
And another important symbol beyond the symbol is the fact now that your majority leader in the House is female.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And she's doing a wonderful job. I will try to do this as quickly as possible, but obviously over the years I've paid a little bit of attention to the difference in the way in which men and women approach a problem solving. And I have found, and I've also backed up by research, that women tend to be more inclusive. They tend to be more consensus builders. Men tend to be more of authority driven, and you have layers of responsibility and you report on up. Well, I find it very interesting that Harvard Business School several decades ago changed their model and said walk-around management is far more effective management than the top-down management. And so I look with great, I really welcome the opportunity to bring that kind of openness into decision-making.
Great. Now you have some legislation pending, of course. One relates to the definition of birth control. Talk to us about that and why that's important.
I think this is maybe the 17th year. There's been a whole string of women over the years who've introduced this identical language, which says that any birth control that is approved by the FDA will not be considered an abortion in Virginia. And the reason for this, it's not about the morning after pill. It's about basic birth control. It's about the pill, which if it doesn't keep the egg from coming down, will keep a fertilized egg from implanting. If your definition of when life begins is the moment that egg and sperm meet, that's conception, then anything that's contraception, birth control, keeps it from implanting, is defined as an abortion. Same thing absolutely for the IUD. So the basic type of birth control that we take for granted by some philosophy and definition is in fact an abortion. And this just makes a statement that will not be treated in any of our laws that pertain to birth control. And the fact that it has never passed, I think, says volumes. And I certainly, what I was just citing was from the opponents to it, as they have explained their definition of abortion. So I think it's well over 95% of people use birth control. This is a basic, important, responsible means to take on the challenges and the responsibility of parenting, and do so in a conscious way. And that birth control is something that we all take for granted and needs to be in the law. And the fact that it hasn't been is rather questionable to me. Final thing I'll say on that, the latest excuse that I dealt with last year, it wasn't even heard. The year before, well, we're referring to the federal government. Well, there's over 220 places in the code where we are referring to, particularly FDA, and when we're talking about cancer or controlled substances, etc.
Is the ultrasound law still in effect?
It is. This isn't one that I am carrying, but there is legislation out there where, again, you don't override the medical judgment with unnecessary and, in this case, particularly ineffective and degrading, because until about the 8th or 9th week of pregnancy, it's going to have to be an intrauterine ultrasound, and unnecessary.
We're coming up on the census count again, and there are calls once more for a nonpartisan commission to draw legislative districts, and legislative and congressional districts. We've got matters pending in the courts. How important do you think gerrymandering and redistricting are?
Oh, Woody. In 2001, I got 40% new district, consciously at that time because I represented the westernmost Democrat, and if the Democratic strength was packed inward, then my district was more competitive, which actually I love a competitive district. It means I'm able to have this kind of dialogue and better prepared to understand what the issues are. So I survived that. 10 years later, I got 42% new district. I only needed a couple of thousand, and 60,000 are taken away, and 50,000. It's most unfortunate in the way in which I have termed it, because I have lived it. Two things. One, how are you going to hold me accountable when you don't even know who your delegate is? And secondly, there is a major aspect of my responsibility, which is constituent service. I do represent that bridge into effective government, and I have to learn 40% new territory, 40% new territory, every drainage ditch, every school crossing, etc. This is unfair to the voters on that basis. And then finally, the biggest problem that surfaced in 2017, when you had plus or minus 1% with a gerrymandering, which the courts have found was done specifically, plus or minus 800 people, to pack as many blacks into as few districts as possible, done statewide. That meant that I have 4 out of my 5 precincts are split precincts. One of them is particularly bad, just like in Fredericksburg, just like in Newport News. You don't know where the household, which district it actually resides in. Is it this side of the cul-de-sac, that side of the cul-de-sac, straight across? Is it where is it where the bedroom is? So all of that are all issues where it is robbing people not only of the community, but also being properly counted.
Thank you so much, Delegate Vivian Watts. Good to see you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.